evening. I think we should get started. It's very nice to see all of you here. I know that it's, given the news out of Boston, it's an unsettling evening. And I think it's nice that you decided to come anyway and to just go about our business thinking about the world we live in and the world we confront. So I'm very happy to see you here, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. We had a wonderful panel here this evening to talk about Egypt. It is not my job to introduce any of them. You have their bios in front of you, and Larry will make short introductions. But I want to say a few words about our moderator, Lawrence Wright. For those of you who have been coming to center events for the past decade, you know that he is a welcome guest and a frequent guest at the center. One of the reasons he's such a frequent guest is that his interests, his work, his expertise, his thinking covers so many of the topics that the center has chosen to focus on, many of which converge in national security. We know him best for his book, The Looming Tower, which is perhaps the most widely accepted seminal work on understanding al-Qaeda and understanding 9/11. More recently, he did a book called Going Clear, Scientology, Hollywood, and the Prison of Belief. You might say he's interested in cults, in the power of belief, in the attraction of belief, and in the potential destructiveness of belief. And even though it's not really national security the way you might think of it, I encourage you to read his book on Scientology. Larry's interest in Egypt goes way beyond the Looming Tower. As a young individual, a young man, he taught at the American University in Cairo for a couple of years and was able to see a number of important events, which I'll leave it to him if he wants to tell you about them. But I wanted to read to you from two of the things that Larry has said about Egypt in the past couple of years, because I think they are nice framing for how to think about Egypt and why he's the moderator tonight. And so I'm going to read them. One is on Zawahiri, who you know inherited al-Qaeda after bin Laden. And here's what Larry said, talking not about Zawahiri, but about Egypt. The future of Egypt will determine much of what happens in the rest of the Arab world. No matter how it turns out, the Egyptian revolution will be seen historically as a bookend to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which added reality to the radical Islamist agenda and inspired so many young Muslims. And then I wanted to read from something he wrote more recently, which was this. America is unlikely to have any influence on the future of Egypt if it continually opposes and demonizes the longing of Egyptians to achieve real democratic expression with all of its hazards. The reason I picked these two excerpts is because I think what we're going to try to do tonight, and what Lawrence Wright is so well equipped to do, is to think about both the issue of radicalization, what the Arab awakening was really about, and also what the burden and responsibility is and is not in terms of the United States and its foreign policy. I love having Larry here. I look forward to tonight. So Larry, it's yours.
I know there is a plaque in Montgomery, Alabama, with the names of the martyrs of the Civil Rights Movement. Some of those names you would recognize, Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King. Most of them names we don't know, but on that plaque there are 40 names. 40 names of people who died in a revolution, a civil rights transformation that completely changed our society. The Arab Spring, the nonviolent revolutions that began that episode in history were deeply informed by the American Civil Rights Movement. And it's striking to me that in the 18 days of the revolution in Egypt, more than 840 people died. I think the scale of the trauma is something that we have a hard time appreciating from a distance, and something that's still rocking that country. many more people have died since then, of course. Now, who was in that revolution? It was conspicuously youthful. There were many technocrats in it, a new generation of Egyptians that I was really excited to see. There were many women, covered and uncovered. And the Muslim brothers who came late to the revolution, but have apparently inherited the fruits of it. We are in a moment of transition. Egypt is not where it was, and is not where it's going to be. And in such moments are very dangerous and very vulnerable moments, because every action by people in power can set a tradition, a new trend, a law. Everything that is done now sets a precedent. So the behavior of people in power in Egypt is extremely important to observe. I'm joined to talk about the winter that has come to the Arab Spring so quickly by three marvelous experts. Mohammed El-Minshawi is the Director of Languages and Regional Studies Program in the Middle East Institute, and he writes a column for Al-Shuruk. Samir Shahata is Assistant Professor of Arab Politics at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. I'm glad I don't have to write you a letter. Robin Wright, author and journalist, reported in more than 140 countries, and her most recent book is Rock the Casbah, Rage and Rebellion Across the Islamic World. And I'd like to start with Robin because something that she said recently caught my ear. You talked about the fog of transition. We know about the fog of war, and maybe you can explain a little bit about what we're going through right now, what trends you see.
Thanks, Larry, and thank you, Karen, for organizing this. The fog of transition really is that horrible moment when you live in a kind of political purgatory, a twilight zone, and we all know that the old order is gone. And the problem is that there isn't a new order yet, and that's still shaking out, and that takes a long time. We tend to look at elections and think those are the most decisive turning points, that once you get someone who's replacing the ancien regime, that you've kind of made the transition. And the reality is that it's really establishing the rules by which you're going to govern society, that the new order begins to take shape. And remember, we went through a long period of amending our own constitution before things even began to settle down in this country, and it took 13 years to write a constitution here. One of the things that has struck me, and it's interesting that Larry talked about how the role of Iran in being one bookend and the Egyptian revolution being, or uprising being the other, and the kind of similarities in terms of their political experience, because today in Egypt you have a polarization that is in many ways unprecedented. Whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood on one end and the Salafis on the other, and there's a whole Islamic spectrum, or Islamist spectrum, that has emerged. It's redefining politics. But then on the other extreme, you have secular parties and liberal parties. And remember, secular parties are not always liberal. We fall into the trap of thinking, oh, they're secular and therefore they must be good, when in fact, in many cases, they are not the most constructive players, and are even slowing the democratic process, boycotting elections. You think of someone even like Mohammed al-Baradei, who won the Nobel Peace Prize as head of the UN nuclear watchdog agency, and he threw his hat in the ring to be president, and then turned around when he was not a popular candidate and said, oh, well, he was going to boycott the presidential vote. And I was actually at a conference with him in Vienna last year during the vote, and I said, oh, did you vote by absentee? He said, no, I'm not going to vote. Which, you know, is kind of shocking at an early stage, the arrogance of, well, if I'm not going to have an impact, or if I can't win, I'm not going to participate. And that's a very destructive component. So I think we sometimes think, oh, well, the secular and the liberals and the nationalists and so forth are the good guys, when in fact, they're not willing to be fair players. And I think that's one of the problems in the fog of transition. The second one is the basic issue of the economy. We tend to forget that the uprisings began not because groups wanted to vote for liberal democratic parties, but because they really were tired of the corruption, the nepotism, the deterioration of society because of the greed of the ruling elites. And I went back to Tunisia, where the uprisings began, when a young fruit vendor set himself on fire, and I went to the fruit vendors who had taken his place, and it was resonated later in Egypt, the same thing. When I asked them how did they feel a year later, they all said the same thing. We have far more freedoms, but far fewer jobs. And they were actually more unhappy with their situation, because there is a sense of entitlement. And that's the essential political conundrum in the transition, this fog of transition, that people understand half of democracy, and that is entitlement. And so everyone thinks they're entitled to be a player or whatever. You see this across Egypt. Everybody thinks that it's their right, and not that sense of responsibility. There's a culture of me, and not us, 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 us. They haven't figured out, because of this polarization, how to, whether it's build a compromise, consensus, to coalesce into parties. We had over 60 parties that were running for parliament, 13 candidates for president, and this just isn't viable, as we know, in our own system. And these are also very short elections in countries, particularly Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, more than any other, that have very limited democratic experience. They don't know how to organize a campaign. They don't have the resource base. They don't know how to develop a platform. And so in this fog of transition, you have a deep polarization that is again, because of the combination of the sense of entitlement, but also the fear. And there's a fear because of the old system that I have to have a little bit more than the next guy in order to protect my interests. My tribe, my neighborhood, my family, my clan. And as a result, whether it's the kind of quasi-militias that are emerging, the thugs that have emerged, the black guys, the block guys. I mean, it is the sense of, well, I have entitlement and I've got to protect my turf and so forth. And so there is a clash that is very destructive. You have a kind of centrifugal force of that is undermining this vibrant political experience. Now, I'll stop with just one final thought. You know, we have, in many ways, false expectations because of what the media did in calling it an Arab Spring to begin with, giving it the illusion that this was going to be something that happened quickly. You know, when you think about in the United States, it took 60 years for us to get from the 12th to the 13th Amendment, and only after a very destructive and costly, in terms of human life, civil war, and then it took 100 years to get the Civil Rights Act, and we're now at a point where we have the Voting Rights Act in front of the Supreme Court. So transitions are never smooth, they're never short. The Soviet Union, a generation later, Russia is led by a former communist and KGB chief who may be there until 2024. In South Africa, where I covered the uprising in 1976 and went back when Nelson Mandela walked to freedom. Over 20 of the 25 million people today in South Africa live in poverty. They're far worse off, blacks, than they were under apartheid. The average life expectancy when Nelson Mandela walked to freedom was 60 years, and today it's 41. That this is tangible, and so that the fog of transition is going to be with us a very long time.
Thank you, Robin. Samar, I mentioned that the Muslim Brothers had come late to the party, but they were there when the lights went on. And did they deserve this country? And what has power done to the Muslim Brothers?
Right. Well, I think that's exactly right in how you put it, and I like to add that they came late to the party and they left early. And that's what and they got the cake. right? And that's what many of the kind of youth who initiated the uprising, as well as other political players, tend to say. Do they deserve it? And I think if we think for a moment about why they came late and why they left early, it provides some insight into the organization, at least the organization and the social movement and the political party and the social welfare outfit and the idea, because the Muslim Brotherhood is a hard thing to understand. It's not a political party. It is what I call an encompassing social movement. It began in 1928 in Ismailia, in a very different world, in a world of British colonialism, French colonialism, other colonialism, and so on. And Egypt was ruled to some extent by a group, including the British, so it was occupied. There was economic exploitation, and there was a general sense that the West was progressing, and Egypt and the Muslim world, or the Ummah, was not, and Islam was the answer in a way. And it was the reason, in fact, that Egypt and the Muslim world had not progressed, not in the Bernard Lewis sense of Islam being the problem, in the sense that Muslims weren't practicing Islam properly, and a return to Islam, or practicing Islam properly, understanding all of its different dimensions, not just as a series of rituals and so on, would then provide the solution. That's what the Muslim Brotherhood was, and is, although I think it's changed quite considerably after the uprising. It was a reform movement, a social, political, ideological reform movement, not a revolutionary movement. As the deputy guide of the movement tells me, and has told me on a number of occasions, revolution isn't in our lexicon. That's not the kind of organization they were. And that's why they didn't join the uprising on January 25th or 26th or 27th. They waited until the 28th to participate in the protests. Once they saw the direction things were going, once they realized that this was a serious opportunity to bring about change, and I think once they concluded also that if the uprising didn't succeed, they were going to be the primary target of the wrath of the regime. And so their cost-benefit calculation changed, and they put their weight with the protesters. And again, this is a movement, maybe like many other movements, which is an opportunistic movement. And at different times during the 18 days, actually, they recalculated whether they should continue to go for gold and oust Mubarak, or whether they should make a deal with Mubarak. And in fact, they negotiated with the regime on a number of occasions, most interestingly on February 6, 2011, when Mubarak was still in power. And there are reports, and in fact I've done some research to indicate that they might have been willing to take a deal, legalize the Brotherhood, give us some guarantees, will allow you to stay in power. So they're not a revolutionary group. The other thing I would say, and this is, so your quotation, which I think is great, is they came late and they left early. Robbins, which I'll comment on, I think is also correct. Maybe a bit too much. I have to be a little bit of a fan of Wright. But nevertheless, the liberals and the secular groups in Egypt deserve some blame. I tend to say, and this is overly simplistic, but nevertheless I think it captures something important about Egypt, which is Egypt, unfortunately, is a place where we have Democrats who aren't liberals and liberals who aren't Democrats. And what I mean by that is the Muslim Brotherhood is an organization, and many Islamists, not all Islamists, many Islamists, who are now committed to the minimal electoral principle. That is, if you win a majority, you get to rule. But they're not liberals in the sense of believing in the kind of fundamental political and civil rights that many of us kind of take for granted and that accompany what we think of democracy as liberal democracy, not just simple majoritarianism. And the liberal secular groups in Egypt, they state that they are Democrats and they believe in personal freedoms and so on, but that extends only so far as them winning. If the Islamists win, they don't believe in democracy. They want the government, the military to get involved, or they want something else. And that's a basic problem. And, you know, I guess I'll end, because you warned me not to go on too long, and I have a tendency to do so because I'm a university professor, which is the Brotherhood and their now Freedom and Justice Party, which is really just the Brotherhood's political wing, it's nothing separate from the organization, is facing possibly its most profound historic challenge to the group. I mean, this is a group that began in 1928. I said at the time of the Mubarak regime that it would last longer than the Mubarak regime. It's suffered tremendous repression and torture and exile under Gamal Abdel Nasser. Its leader was assassinated by the Egyptian government before the 1952 Egyptian uprising, Hassan al-Banna's assassination. It faced periods of repression under Mr. Mubarak and so on. But now that they have actually come to power, they are facing profound challenges and difficulties for all kinds of reasons. I mean, it's never easy to govern. It's terribly hard to govern after an uprising, after not 30, but 50 years of authoritarian rule, in a country where 40% of the population live on $2 a day, or close to $2 a day, in which you have a state that is ossified, a 6 million person bureaucratic state that is ossified and that is dysfunctional in many ways and so on, in a society that hasn't had any significant security sector reform. And the revolution or the uprising took place on January 25th intentionally because that is Police Day, and it was a protest at the kind of daily oppression and the small and large injustices that the police afflicted on Egyptians and so on. So they're in a very, very difficult position. They've been, and they'll admit this, and this is a polite way of saying it, is underprepared and overwhelmed by the challenges of governing. And they've also governed badly, and so on. And they deserve a tremendous amount of blame as well. More blame, I would say, than the secular liberals for what Egypt is facing today. Egypt's kind of current and very important impasse. So you're right, we don't know, it's a transition, we don't know where it's going, certainly. And right now, in particular, more so than any time since Mubarak's ouster on February 11th, Egypt faces an impasse, a political impasse, an economic impasse, and a security impasse. I'll stop there.
Well, the most notable figure in that movement now is the President Mohamed Morsi. And Mohamed, I wish you would tell us a little bit. He's a puzzling figure. As soon as you think you know who he is, he does something kind of surprising. And maybe he's surprising himself. But I remember when he went to Iran, and the American political establishment was so upset. And then when he got there, he upbraided the Iranians. He has the capacity to surprise people, but boy, he seems to make a lot of freshman mistakes. And culturally, I'm sure it's different in Egypt living under Morsi than it was under Mubarak. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about Egypt now under Morsi and how he's reflected in that culture.
Sure. Morsi is a good representation of the Muslim Brotherhood in general. If you know about the high school diploma in Egypt, that's the whole dilemma of the Muslim Brotherhood as we know today. In high school diploma, it's a nightmare for all families in Egypt. People can invest a lot of money, borrow money to have private tutor for high school students. And there's two tracks for high school in Egypt, at least recently. Either you go to social science and you can study logic and philosophy and critical thinking, or hard science, which engineer, math, physics, biology, natural science. And the Brotherhood cadre and leadership, at least 90% of them choose the second one. They are either doctors or physician, or technocrat, engineers. Most of them, and Morsi is a classic example of that. He's an engineer by training, and he represents the Brotherhood in best option, best feature today. This guy was not supposed to be a president. He was second two in the list of potential president from the Muslim Brotherhood. First one was another engineer called Muhammad Khairi al-Shatir, who was disqualified by the election commission 5 weeks before the election. So this guy campaigned only for 5 weeks. He was not prepared or aware that he would be the president of Egypt or even the presidential candidate of the Muslim Brotherhood, but he is now. And Morsi represents another new reality in the exceptional policy we have in Egypt and exceptional time in Egypt. He is from outside Cairo. He lives in an area called Sharqiyya, which about 100 miles away from Cairo, in a small apartment. And you can see, if you visit this area, garbage in the streets. It's not upscale by any standards, and he is real middle class by Egyptian standards. Though he has a PhD from California, but his English is worse than mine, and he doesn't belong at any point of his history to the Egyptian elite that used to rule Egypt in the last at least 60 years. And he is good representation of the conflict we are witnessing now of class in Egypt, which not were reported in Western media. The upper class that used to rule Egypt in the last decade, English and French-speaking elite, that failed the society and the country. And now we have lower and middle class represented by Muslim Brotherhood and by Morsi himself, that they are in shock. Aside from that, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Supreme Guide, Dr. Muhammad Badia, he as well from outside Cairo. So these people used to live in the rural area, not the big cities. So there is big conflict taking place now between the urban elite and the rural elite that emerged in form of Islamists. And if we look at the election map in the presidential, in the parliamentary one, it's obviously the Islamists, either Salafist or Muslim Brotherhood, their main gain is outside Cairo, the big city in Egypt, which 1/4 of the population lives there, about 20 million people. But it tells us about a silent conflict, a class conflict that's taking place in Egypt, aside from the division of liberal or Islamist or leftist. That's another one. But Morsi was not #1 choice for the Muslim Brotherhood to be a president, and being in the president office today represents another dilemma. He has 3 hats. He was member of the Supreme Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood within 18 people or 20 in different accounts, and he was the head of the Freedom and Justice Party, the official part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he's the current president. And the decision-making process in the last 30 years was known to be the office of former President Post-Mubarak. Nowadays, we don't know who is pulling the shot. Is it Morsi? Is it the head of the Supreme Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood, Dr. Muhammad Badia, or the replacement of Morsi as the head of the Freedom and Justice Party? There is 3 separate powers, and the dynamics between these circuits are unknown and very difficult to penetrate or to expect. However, there are some figures beside Morsi who carry some weight from the guidance bureau of the Brotherhood who joined the regime of Morsi, the administration of Morsi. 2 names. One of them is Dr. Assam Haddad, which I get to know and I meet frequently. He makes himself available. And Dr. Ali Bishr. These 2 people, 2 names. One of them is in charge of the foreign policy files and one for domestic policy. And these are only people. One of them is assistant to the president for foreign affairs, and one is a minister for urban planning and domestic development, which is very important because they draw the electoral map in Egypt, and that could influence who will win the next election. And these 2 people, besides Morsi, they do a lot of important decisions in Egypt without clear mandate who is doing what and what the influence of the other hats they carry, and that's need a lot of research. And unfortunately, they don't talk about it. When you tell or ask one of them who does this decision, who said what, who asked to attack Iran in Tehran or attack Syrian regime in the podium in Tehran, they won't answer you, and this area is black box, nobody knows about. However, Morsi represents as well a good news for Egypt. Islam finally is in power. That's good news because it was always theoretical concept and theory, what they will do in office. They have this slogan for the last 60 years, though they were illegitimate, Islam is a solution. That's beautiful, that's lovely if they will deliver in terms of service and goods for the people, but they don't so far. So this slogan is very much in the margin now. The Freedom and Justice Party of the Brotherhood choose a slogan for in the election, we brought the good for Egypt. They don't use Islam as a solution in the last one when they saw it's very near they will succeed and be the body to run the government. So they changed the slogan of Islam as a solution because they really figured out they will be in charge and Islam won't deliver as any religion, materialistic delivery to the people in terms of goods and service. So that's a good something to have, and I hope it will be the confrontation between Islamists and the message and today's reality. Because in the basic Islamic teaching, a lot of basic Islamic teaching is against what we practice nowadays in Egypt and in the global economy in terms of at least finance and banking system, and they are finding a third way or manipulating both ways to find a good way out. And that will be good because it will maybe bankrupt the slogan of Islam as a solution, which should be healthy. You should put religion aside when it comes to politics. And I believe it will force the non-Islamists in Egypt to do a lot of real work outside Cairo and outside elitist neighborhood of Cairo. What I want to finish here is, if you liberate yourself from the expectation of liberal outcomes of Egypt's revolution, Egypt is doing great. Economically, numbers are bad, of course, but in the last 2 years, from the day you storm the streets in Cairo, I hear Egypt in the collapse of economic, Egypt in the near economic collapse. So now it's about 2 years and 3 months and nothing really happened. The economy is bad, yes, but there is informal economy, which people don't count. World Bank and IMF don't know about. My family village in Munufeya, which about 70 miles outside of Cairo, they don't do modern economy. People grow some vegetables, they exchange, they do bread at home, it's not accounted for, they have some animals, and all these figures are not put in the paper. So a lot of economy in Egypt, a lot of activities are not reported. So the idea of Egypt in verge of collapse economically, I don't buy it because I hear that last 2 years, and before that, during last years of Mubarak, Egypt did very well in terms of numbers by World Bank and IMF indications. However, as Dr. Samuel mentioned, 40% of Egyptians lived and still under $2 a day. So these big numbers and growth, it doesn't really apply to most Egyptians, and they don't care if the growth is 7% or near zero as we have now. Thank you.
You know, what you said makes me recall in 2008, I was in Cairo, and I made a speech at Cairo University in the same place Barack Obama. He was in the primaries at the time.
That's my university.
Oh, is it? All right. I was struck by all these young people, by the way, I took a poll about who they would vote for during the American election, and all the women in the hijab were for Hillary, and a lot of the boys were for Barack Obama. Nobody was for McCain. But one of the girls in the audience made some rather despairing remark about when will Egypt get ahead? When will we get up? You know, and I thought about how when I was teaching there long ago, in 1969, 71, Egypt was about in the same spot as China, India, Korea, Singapore. These economies have all rocketed out of their basket case status, but Egypt never has. And I said to that girl, I think it takes a generation. You know, I think it takes a generation to decide that we're going to change, and the whole generation does it. And those generations, you know, my father's generation did that here. Generations like that are doing that in Korea and in places like that. Those people have taken charge. I didn't realize that I was talking to the kids that were going to be in Tahrir Square. What happened to them? Where are they now? And where is their future in Egypt? I've asked all of you to answer that.
Well, you know, there were a lot of people in Tahrir, obviously. But if you, what you mean by that is the people who, or some of the people who initiated the uprising on January 25, and the young people who have been represented very, prominently in the media and so on. The April 6th group, some of the We Are al-Qaeda group, and some of the youth wings of the different political parties and so on. I think some of them were out on the streets and have been out on the streets over the last couple of years. Some of them have. Others have, I think, are now despairing really at the situation. They're certainly not in power, but this is something that, isn't that surprising for those of us who know anything about revolutions, right? Oftentimes those groups and social forces that make revolutions don't necessarily come to power, right? And some of them are still attempting to participate in the political process. There have been many new parties formed. And in fact, it is the youth wings of many of the political parties that are the most active. I mean, so for example, not only after the uprising, but during the uprising, because of the Muslim Brotherhood's reticence to fully put their weight behind the protests against the Mubarak regime, there were many members of the Muslim Brotherhood, young, youthful members of the Muslim Brotherhood, who rebelled and who broke away from the organization and who started their own political movements independent of the Muslim Brotherhood. In some of the more established political parties and some of the new ones, I'm thinking of Mr. al-Baradei's Constitution Party, for example. It is the younger members who are the ones who are asking for transparency and accountability, and they're not willing to take the appointment of leaders based on, Mr. al-Baradei or others and so on. But, and this doesn't necessarily speak to the, the intention of your question, but this is something to follow up on one of the things that Muhammad said about the economy, and although related to youth, and although I think that he is correct that, it's been said many, many times that Egypt is in economic crisis and so on, both after the uprising, but if anyone knows anything about Egypt's history in the last 40 or 50 years, but there are 1 million more people who are unemployed today in Egypt than there were on January 25th or February 11th, 2011. So I do think that the economic situation has deteriorated. Some of the people who are hurting are youth.
I want to encourage us to tell stories, so I want to tell you about two people who participated in Tahrir Square. And one of them was a young woman. And I think what was so transparent to those of us who followed Egypt for a long time was that this was coming, that there was something fundamental that had changed, whether it was because of demographics, the fact that for the first time you had the majority of people literate. They might not have college degrees, high school diplomas, but they had an ability to understand what was happening elsewhere in the world over the previous 30 years, and they had the tools of technology both to communicate with the outside world and get their message across. They were kind of empowered through other means before they took to the streets. But one of my favorite stories is about a young woman who, at the age of 8, was told by her mother to put on a party dress, and she was going to be taken off for a special occasion, and she was instead taken off for her circumcision. And she was so horrified by what she went through that she then fought within her family, with her uncles and her father, to make sure this didn't happen to her sister and cousins. And time again, she lost until she stayed up all night with one of her uncles and said, to argue not to do this to the last cousin. And at one point she said to him, if you do this to her, I will cut off her finger. And he said, why would you do that? That will maim her for life. And she said, duh. And thought she'd lost again, but she didn't. And uncle called and said, I won't do this to her, you convinced me. So then she became active on her school talking about a taboo subject in Egypt, which is female genital mutilation, which happens to over 80% of girls, Christian and Muslim. It has nothing to do with religion, it has to do with cultural traditions in that part of Northeast Africa. And it's common in Sudan as well. And she gradually evolved until she became, in college, she became a blogger. She's a lower middle class girl, wears a job, father was in the military, and she actually took, in trying to explain to young people what human rights were, she found out about a comic book about the Montgomery story. And with instructions in the back of the comic book telling about Martin Luther King's the bus boycott and then walk to freedom. And it had instructions on civil disobedience. She translated the whole comic book and the instructions into Arabic and made that available to over 2,000 bloggers from Morocco to Yemen. She was in Tahrir Square distributing it. She, after Mubarak was ousted, she decided at the grand old age of 29 that she wanted to run for parliament. And Tahrir Square was in her constituency. She ran with the Justice Party. And what kind of said, well, you know, given your faith and observance and so forth, you have no temptation to run with the Muslim Brotherhood. She turned to me and she said, oh, to hell with the Muslim Brotherhood. And I said, is that on the record? She said, absolutely. And she lost. But afterwards, she was very stoic about it. And she said, it was a very, she said, I didn't know how to campaign, didn't know how to develop a platform, but this really taught me a lot, and I plan to use it again when I run for office, because I intend down the road to be the first female president in Egypt. Now, I don't think she will be, but the mere fact that you have this generation that's been in the works, now she's 29, that has come, started at the age of 8, she's 29 now, and she has a generation to go until she gets someplace, but she's there. The other one is a briefer story, and it has to do with the grandson and a great-grandson of leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, a fellow named Ibrahim Hudabi, who was well into the path of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he had a falling out over the basic issue of which comes first, freedom or religion. And his grandfather, who as he was dying, and was then head of the Muslim Brotherhood, argued with him that you cannot be free unless you live in a purely Islamic context. And Ibrahim said to his grandfather, I think you can't be a true Muslim unless you are free first, because you have to be free to come to your faith of your own free will. And that's a debate that now rages across the Middle East. We tend to look at kind of who's in power, who's been elected, and so forth, but we lose sight of this much bigger context of what's happening in the region. And that's where, for all the awful headlines that we see in the papers, and the pictures, and the protests, and the deaths, and the 12,000 who've been tried by military courts since Mubarak was ousted, the fact is there is a cultural change that is as important as the politics of change. There is a mindset that's totally different. And this is where the youth are the pivot. And it'll be a generation until they get there. But they will get there. And not evenly, not in agreement, but they are, when you think in our generation, what the same, when the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, and women's liberation movement, and so forth, and how far we've come in a generation in this country. And they will too.
Mohammed, you wanted to say something about that?
Yeah, no, I was
Yeah. All right, you remember the art.
I will assume the youth we are talking about, they are from age 18 till 30, let's say, and they are like any youth in the world. They are not leading, nor here in America or in Europe or any other country. They are going to school, they are searching for a job, they are maybe dating somebody, aiming to form a family. But we don't have first layer of leadership anywhere who are youth. That's human nature, unfortunately. I wish they are getting to leading position in this early age, but it doesn't happen anywhere. And as you said, both here, when the time will come, they won't be youth. There will be another youth in that time. When they are 40, 50, 60s, and in leading position, there will be other generations who are late teenager and 20s who will be called youth and have another dream and other expectations. So the youth of the revolution, like any youth, some of them are with the Islamists, some of them are very conservative Salafist, some of them are very liberal, but they are not in any leading position because that is the social structure globally and the human nature, unfortunately. And as I said, they don't expect, and no one should expect, youth in the early 20s to lead a country of 90 million people in this dramatic, exceptional way after succeeding of toppling a dictator. That was very romantic and doesn't take place in reality. So where is the youth of Tahrir Square? They are doing their own business. Some of them are active online, some of them are going to political parties, some of them are thinking of the future, but they are there, they don't disappear, and they have some involvement in social activism and political activism, but they are there, and they are not losers. They just did their role at a specific time, and the door is emerging now, and maybe they don't know what they are doing. Maybe they will be in the winning side with the Islamists, maybe they are in the losing side with liberal as of today, but they are there, and we shouldn't blame them or expect any unrealistic symptoms.
I just want to say, one thing about two very small points about this. The very direct answer to your question, if I want to be, incredibly succinct and overly simplistic, is that from the perspective of many of the youth and so on, the revolution has been stolen. Those aren't my words because I don't think there was a revolution in Egypt, but the revolution has been stolen. They orchestrated the uprising. It wasn't the leaders of political parties. It wasn't the opposition elites. It was people like Ahmed Meher of the April 6th movement, and most famously Wa'il Ghunaim of We Are All Khaled Saeed, and other youth, activists and so on. And now this revolution has been stolen not only by the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, a party, as I mentioned, an organization that has existed since 1928 and was the primary opposition group under Mubarak. But if we look at the people who are the major political players in Egypt today, right, the names, they're all people who not only are old, but they were the political players in Egypt when Mubarak was in power. Mohammed al-Baradei, okay, he's relatively recent, but he's up there in the age, and he was on the scene when Mubarak was still in power. Amr Musa, right? I mean, he was the foreign minister between 1991 and 2000, and he's in his mid to late 70s. Hamdin Sabahi, right, who was a parliamentarian, opposition parliamentarian from 2000 until, 2010 or 2005 and so on. So the short answer is the revolution has been stolen. The second very brief point is with regard to something that Muhammad said, which I agree generally, but I think it is important to recognize that in Egypt and maybe in some other countries, there is a kind of generational problem, meaning that, it is the case, and it has been the case, that politics, both at the level of the state, Mr. Mubarak was, I think, 82 when the uprising occurred, but also at the level of political parties, at the level of the leadership of other kinds of organizations in Egypt and so on, there is the dominance of very old people, right? I mean, when we had in Egypt in 2004 a prime minister who was appointed who was in his mid to late 50s, we were saying, wow, look at this guy, he's a spring chicken. We usually get prime ministers who are in their late 60s, early 70s, right? And so there is this problem where power is not even close to being evenly distributed among age cohorts and so on in Egypt. There is, unfortunately, the case where the older generations dominate political parties, they dominate educational institutions, they dominate other institutions in life.
Well, apropos the bombing that took place today in Boston, it awakens the imagination of what might happen in terms of Islamic radicalism, not drawing any parallels with Boston. I'm not making any statements about that, but Egypt has a long history with terrorism, and the Muslim Brothers have a long relationship with that history. They have stepped out of the shadows and into parliamentary democracy, and that has caused a break with more radical elements of Islam. But they do, and one thing we could say about Morsi is that, you know, his relationship with Hamas has maybe mended some of the problems in the Palestinian territories. But the potential for turn towards more radical movements is certainly there. And there, I think, is it correct to say 25% of the vote was the more radical party? And the fact that they're participating in a democratic election is, of course, anathema to al-Qaeda. But the other factor is the trend towards chaos, in which radicalism always prospers and al-Qaeda flocks to. So what are we looking at in terms of radicalism and the trend towards violence in the next several years?
You know, to me, the most interesting thing we don't focus on enough is that the Arab uprisings were not just a rejection of autocrats, they were a rejection of extremism and violence. That this is the most violent corner of the world, the longest running conflict, 60 plus years. And yet, in every place, including for months in Syria, you saw people turn to peaceful civil disobedience. That, in many ways, was quite an extraordinary development. And I think in the decade after 9/11, there was a recognition that al-Qaeda and its surrogates and allies do not deliver the things the majority want, whether it's health care, education, or jobs, the right to marry and get an apartment. That there was this important swing. I went to Saudi Arabia and interviewed several of the Gitmo detainees and was struck by how many of them were profoundly disillusioned by al-Qaeda, that they had shed their ideology, that life is about much more practical realities, that there is a sense of globalization. It's not just what's happening locally in terms of getting a job or whatever, but it's also what's happening globally in the sense that they want to be part of it. And that people wanted a computer rather than a suicide vest. I mean, they're in extraordinary numbers. And I think that's, you know, one of the most important developments. Whether whatever's happened here has any relation to it, you know, who knows. But this is a fundamental turning point. And what's even striking is the radicals we talk about today, the Salafis, the ultra-conservatives, who want to recreate the kind of political world that al-Qaeda once advocated. Salaf means ancestor, it means going back to the time of the first 3 generations after the religion was founded in the 7th century. That the Salafis, the majority of them, are also not supporting violence. That yes, there are some, whether it's attacking the U.S. mission in Benghazi or the U.S. embassies in Cairo and Tunis, but that for the majority of them, you find that they're coming in from the political cold and they want to participate in the system. And that you see in Egypt today the proliferation of Salafi groups. They are competing with each other. And the irony is that while we focus on the Muslim Brotherhood versus the secular parties, the real tension really is among the 72% who voted for the two parties, the Salafi trend and the Muslim Brotherhood trend, who together won 72% of the vote for parliament, and which is so striking. When I went to see members of both of them after the parliamentary election, the Muslim Brotherhood parliamentarians were totally dismissive of the Salafi party and said, oh, they're extremists and they're naive. You know, this delicious moment that they were disavowed another Islamists. And then the Islamists were complaining about the Muslim Brotherhood and saying, oh, you know, they're Muslim yuppies. You know, they've sold their souls to get, you know, access to power and profit and privilege and so forth. So I'm quite stunned by, I hate to call it pragmatism because that's such a volatile word, but the kind of realism that has crept into Islamic politics in many areas. And the fact that when you look at what Egypt has done, whether it was negotiating with both Israel and Hamas last year to end the conflict. And you and I actually saw Issam Haddad the same day, both in Washington. I saw him also in Cairo, and he was very proud of saying, "Don't think the United States dealt with the Israelis and we dealt with with Hamas. We talked to the Israelis too." And he was quite proud of saying on the record that the Muslim Brotherhood had talked to them. And the fact that over the last few weeks, a Muslim Brotherhood government has flooded many of the tunnels from the Sinai into Gaza that carried weapons and food and contraband and so forth, that they've taken actions in very specific ways that, when you think of the rhetoric that came out of their mouths a generation ago, is really quite stunning.
If I may add, just I won't agree on the term radical to classify Egyptian Salafists. They are like the Tea Party here. If we have any way to classify them as radical group, I will call Egyptian Salafists as radical group. And al-Qaeda teaching and discourse never been accepted in Egypt. It's the act of minority in the Islamic faith and the Islamic political movement, and I doubt any serious support they received before, after 9/11. It's in the margin all the time in most Arab countries and most Muslim public. And to try to bring Salafis to discussion about Al-Qaeda, I believe it's not a good combination. Within the Islamic group in Egypt, there is, as they said, everything. There is very pragmatic, very pro-free market politicians and political agendas. It's very open economy, and there is some group who are very bad to minorities, to women, to Christians, and they do it publicly. But the violence is a red line. Most of them, or all of them now, don't do it, and they don't appreciate it. And they are playing politics, and politics doesn't admire or use violence in today's world. So I will distinguish between the radical description of Salafis. These people are in the parliament and in the cabinet, and they are visiting Western capitals. Some of them coming here next week to Washington to participate in some forum. So if they were radicals, they will never be granted visa to come to Washington. And I would highly question the term used, radical person. Egypt has some good history with terrorism, definitely. We are the birthplace of the teaching of al-Qaeda. That's part of the history. And the top commander of al-Qaeda today is Dr. Zawahiri, Egyptian physician, former member of Egyptian Jihad group. But he has no supporter in Egypt. He is not a welcome figure. He is fugitive by Egyptian authority and Egyptian state and the international community as well. But to try to connect him or to draw any relation between him and his group and the political dilemma, the political dynamics in Egypt today, I believe it's not wise. And I believe if we continue calling them radical, we will turn them to radical, and that's a really scary scenario.
I'm going to open this up for questions now from the audience, and if you will raise your hand, I'll recognize you and speak loudly. Oh, we have a microphone. Oh, well, you don't have to speak so loudly to make this. Yes, sir, right back here. Gotcha.
Does the Egyptian military continue to exercise an ultimate veto power and management authority over not only government composition, government policy, but also economic policy? And if there is a virtue in stability during a transitional period as opposed to a trend towards chaos that might be fertile ground for radicalism, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And how much of a good thing or a bad thing?
Sure. I mean, Mohammed might want to add something to that. I mean, on August 12th, 2012, one of Morsi's first actions was to retire, essentially, Field Marshal Tantawi and Chief of Staff Sami Anan. And Mr. Tantawi, of course, these are members of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces who ran the country from February the 11th, 2011, when Mubarak was forced to resign, until essentially that date. And they were both elements of the old regime, right? Mr. Tantawi was appointed as Minister of Defense in 1991, so he was a very long-serving Minister of Defense. And I think the State Department WikiLeaks cables refer to him at one point as Mr. Mubarak's poodle, right? So that gets to the idea of how much real change, structural change, took place after the uprising. So that was an incredibly important move that Mr. Morsi did, and it was surprising, and there was a historical reason or justification for it that he took advantage of. And it's interesting that before that time, a conversation like this would have been dominated by questions of the military and the Supreme Council and their role in the economy and their relationship with the United States, and so on. And so I think he did something very, very good. I mean, if we did many bad things, but one thing he did very, very good, which was to remove them and to allow some younger members of the military to hold higher positions, but essentially blocking them from daily involvement in the domestic politics of the country, right? So do they interfere or do they play a role in the domestic politics of the country, whether it's economic policy and so on? No, except maybe with regard to the economic interests that they have. Are they still powerful? Do they still exercise some power with regard to some issues, some national security issues, like the Gaza tunnels, for example, which are probably the doing of the military and not the Muslim Brotherhood, we think. The flooding of the tunnels and so on with sewage, certainly yes. Do they exercise some other power? Yes, with regard to, say, certain limits on what Egyptian foreign policy can be with regard to, say, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty or relations with the United States, most certainly yes. But has their power, their political power, been significantly weakened to the point where we're very unlikely to see any kind of overt political exercise of power by the military? I think most definitely.
Yes, sure, Ron.
There is a story, and I don't know that it's true, but I've heard from a number of people that there was actually a kind of deal done to get rid of Tantawi, and that it was when General el-Sisi basically went and said Tantawi was not pleased with what was happening and that he was concerned about what actions he might take, and there was a kind of deal done that eased Tantawi out, gave him a choice. You know, you face a fate like Mubarak, or you get the country's highest award and ease into retirement and privilege. And that in return, Morsi agreed to Article 78 and 79 of the Constitution, which basically create a 15-member National Security Council in which the military or security forces have 8 votes, and which also keep the budget, the military budget, from having to be approved or even shown to Parliament. Now, I don't know whether that's true, but I've heard it from so many people, and including people who are very close to power and one in power, that I tend to think there's something close to it. The interesting thing about the military is that there's such concern about the insecurity in Egypt now, whether it's the crime or the thuggery, that there are some of the young activists who have actually written op-eds suggesting that it's time for the military to step in. And these were people who, up until August last year, were protesting out in the streets against the military and felt that they had moved too far. So there is, I think, this emotional roller coaster or emotional kind of pendulum that's swinging when everybody wants security, wants to get on with life, wants to get a sense that there's some fairness and opportunity, and when it doesn't come, they're kind of looking wildly for anything. So, I agree that the military, I don't think particularly wants to go back in. I think they wanted to protect their perks, their economic interests, and so that was their primary goal. But I don't think we can rule it out.
One more.
Sorry, I'm sure I don't want to say something about this too. I mean, Robin is right that if we look at just a timeline from the time that Mubarak was forced to resign until the present, we see an incredible fluctuation, right? Remember the slogan, even though it was false, at the time of Mubarak's resignation was, you know, the people in the army, one hand, right? And the people in the army together and so on, unified. Now that quickly deteriorated because the military were terrible, miserable, with malice in terms of their kind of ability to rule, as it were. And the Supreme Council faced tremendous opposition, and their popularity, you know, decreased significantly. And then, of course, in the last 4 or 5 months, with Mr. Morsi's bungling and bad decisions and the use of violence, excessive force against civilian protesters, and so on, and the fears that many people have about the Brotherhood, all of a sudden the military stock price has gone up, and people have forgotten their, you know, the very bad things that they did and the very bad things that they do. At the same time, what Robin's point, you know, indicates is the point that I made earlier about people who claim to be liberals but aren't Democrats. I mean, it's absurd that these young people and others are signing petitions requesting the Minister of Defense to stage a coup to take out the president, right? I mean, that is kind of, you know, could be nothing more contradictory to the principle of electoral democracy than that. So this gets to the dilemma, again, that I mentioned earlier.
If I may add about the army, 3 small points. The Constitution guarantees all the rights they wanted in what's called Eagles F1, so they are very happy with the new Constitution. And their budget and their economic enterprise doesn't fall under any supervision from the state or the parliament, elected parliament. And the third point, which I believe under negotiation now between the Brotherhood and the military establishment, when officers is getting to be retired in Egypt before reaching a general level, to a general, usually they promote them to head a public company or public entities or heading any governmental institutions. And their share of this level of very top positions is about 19% as of today. And I believe that would be a good criteria to see their influence in the state. Would they be dominating force in governing Egypt through their new titles after they get rid of their uniform, or that would change under the Brotherhood?
And just one last thing with government. I mean, just recently there came to be a report that was leaked, part of it, in the Egyptian press, that was a study commissioned by President Morsi about, you know, excessive use of violence against protesters and so on, which revealed the military's involvement in even torture and the use of violence against civilian protesters during the uprising and afterwards. And so this is what I was saying about the myth of the military and the people in one hand. I mean, essentially what happened during the uprising was the military, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, many of them have said this on the record, that they gave Mubarak a chance. This is exactly what they say. They gave Mubarak a chance to deal with the protests. And when he failed, they essentially threw him under the bus to save themselves, to save their perks, to save their political power, to save their economic privileges. They were the ones who did the so-called virginity tests, right, in March of 2011 and so on. So you know, I think we have to be clear about what kind of institution at the top level this is and what kind of politics is behind them.
Do we have any questions from Professor Oppenheim's class? Yes.
You know, I guess I'm the third. Like among the Brotherhood's detractors, you often hear this phrase, you know, Tajira being, you know, the sellers of religion. Or, I guess what I'm wondering is like, so like even, you know, any business, you know, requires good marketing, and if you're going to take that, you know, kind of skeptical view of them, I guess as is well known, like torture and like abuse of most fundamental human rights is a really serious problem amongst Egyptian security forces. You know, people have been victimized in many, many terrible situations. Sometimes, you know, people who have like no like space or lawyers, etc. I guess what I'm wondering is, are among the you know, Brotherhood, are there younger members, or are there any who are looking beyond simply the ravings of the site, or, you others, are there any who are looking, because torture is pretty clearly against Islam,
I think that,
are there any building like a religious, ethical, legal argument, to reform the security forces?
I see. It's striking to me that the Muslim Brothers were brought into Tahrir Square by their younger members, and Samar just alluded to the fact that they've actually kind of split off, and that's a generation. One of the questions that we really haven't addressed is this the end of the Muslim Brothers? I mean, they are not an organization that was ever really prepared for power, and now that they've got it, maybe anybody would have failed. Egypt has lots of problems. Had many problems before Mubarak came, but the party that it takes over now is bound to struggle with the future. I've got time for one or two more questions. This man right here.
Thank you for a very good presentation tonight. My question is directed to Mohammed. I believe in your opening remarks, you alluded to, I hope I'm saying this right, something like class consciousness, class conflict. The city and the elites, and the rural, the middle class, and the workers. We have the stalemate now on the political side, the Islamist and the secular. But I wonder how vibrant or what kind of a role is class consciousness, class conflict playing right now in Egypt, beyond the political?
I believe it's slowly emerging conflict in Egypt, and I believe the elite, the Western elite, the old elite of President Mubarak, are more consciously to that elite, because a lot of them don't accept the new leadership, not based on their Islamic identity or political agenda, but purely middle class. I said to some of this old elite here in US, some of them, a lot of them, and in my frequent visit to Egypt, and you will listen to nasty comment and jokes about the wife of President Morsi, the suit kind or the tie of President Morsi, what kind of language he used, what kind of food his kid was seen eating in restaurants. And it's very ugly, in my opinion, but it reflects the rejection of middle class to rule the classic upper class in Egypt. And the middle class are not aware of it because the fruits of their class ruling is not there yet and maybe won't be there for years to come. But the loss of the old elite, the English, French-speaking elite of Cairo, are felt immediately after the collapse of Mubarak and his regime. So it's there, it's emerging, and I believe you can feel it in domestic theater in Egypt, but it's very slowly progressing. So it will come to be maybe loud soon with some class conflicts, physical, violent class conflict or some accidents here and there.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, my question is, the subtitle of this forum was Balancing Security and Justice, but to me most of it has seemed to have been the ideal of democracy and how Egypt possibly got off track. Maybe my opinion is different because I'm somewhat younger, but I've seen several transitions to democracy in Russia, South Africa, Iraq, Afghanistan. None of them seem particularly secure or just. So my question for you is, instead of what went wrong in the revolution, what did you expect to happen?
Well, I think the way to answer your question is, and this might not be satisfactory to many, but I think it is the reality of the situation, is that contingency is profound. The uprising didn't need to end with Mr. Mubarak resigning or being thrown under the bus on February the 11th. I've written a whole paper about this. It was the outcome of this, dialectic between the regime's reaction to the protests and their bungling of the protests and the protesters' increasing appetite and willingness to protest for a number of reasons. So even that outcome, that is Mubarak's resignation, was contingent on so many factors. He was suggesting, and many people were accepting, that he would stay on until September 2011, when there were regularly scheduled presidential elections. Remember, he vowed that he would not seek another term. He vowed that his son would not come. And that was a possibility. And I only mean by this example to show you how things are so contingent. And the idea of prediction for the social sciences is an absurd one. And I don't buy into the model of the social sciences being modeled on the natural sciences, where prediction is a measure of the value of our theories. Prediction is almost impossible in the social sciences because we have human agency and so on. And we can change, you know, we have a role in what happens today and tomorrow and so on. So who would have imagined that Mr. Morsi, the spare tire, that's what he was referred to, because he was not the Muslim Brotherhood's first choice and so on, would be the president of Egypt today. And so I think that, you know, any prediction that Egypt would have been an easy transition to democracy, or that democracy was impossible in Egypt, for whatever, you know, ridiculous reasons one could come up with, Islam, Arab culture, whatever it might be, are false. So I don't think, or one shouldn't have expected anything in particular. Difficulty, most certainly. This Islamist, liberal, secular divide is something that we dealt with before the uprising and have dealt with in Turkey, and now we're dealing with in Tunisia and so on. So that certainly should have been expected. But much more than that, I don't know.
Just briefly, I believe what we could predict, and I believe it's very obvious for me, at least as an Egyptian, is the end of dictatorship in future Egypt. We have perfect dictatorship for 60 years, doesn't last for uprising that lasts 18 days by youth in most of it. And we have military dictatorship ruled for 18 months and doesn't go through, doesn't want to read this experience, they have hard time. And now we have a new Islamic elected government, and they are trying to be authoritarianism, dictatorship sort of, and it won't succeed. The only good news about the future of Egypt I can predict is the end of dictatorship. Any likelihood of dictatorship is ending in Egypt with the experience we have in the last 25 years, which I believe great news.
Can I just add one?
Yeah, sure.
Look, I've spent my whole life covering these upheavals, and one of the things that, I don't go back to 1952, but in 1952 you had the first democracy in Latin America, in Venezuela, and this is a country that later voted democratically to put a strongman in power who, as a military officer, had tried to engage in coup d'etat. And one of my great fears for the region is that we have the Hugo Chavez phenomena because of the insecurity, because of the lack of economic redress, or the sharing of resources, that these problems become insurmountable, that they, not because there isn't the will, but because of the sequence of events that happen. At the same time, I do think Egypt, and I think you can predict a little bit, is already going through an extraordinary evolution politically. The slow, it's not mature, but it's the kind of growth of an awareness that of ideas and diversity. And one of the striking things is that even within the Muslim Brotherhood, when I was there a year ago, talking right after the Parliament, and went to talk to several members, and I said, you know, I've kind of identified 4 different trends within the Muslim Brotherhood. And among the people I saw were the only husband and wife who both ran for Parliament on the Muslim Brotherhood. And the husband turned to me and said, 4? There are at least 20, and my wife and I who were both candidates, don't agree on anything. And that there is this great kind of exploration and experimentation with democratic ideas and so forth. And that takes a long time because people it is an exploration. Nothing's going to settle down anytime soon. So I think when we look down the road, the question is, how unsettled does it get? And does at some point, you know, do the forces pull back and people vote democratically for an authoritarian leader because of the challenges of daily life. And that's, I think, something we have to be sensitive to.
Yes, ma'am. You? Yes, you.
Hi, my question is mostly for Robin, but I guess anyone can answer. Earlier it was discussed that about the failure of the seculars, many people boycotted the elections, but in many cases, wasn't that a rational decision for a number of reasons? One of them is that I don't look at the seculars as Democrats or liberals. In fact, I read that many of these seculars believed that Israel was behind 9/11 and were rabid anti-Semites as well as communists. So I don't know that they were really worth voting for. Mohammed al-Baradei is largely responsible for Iran going nuclear. The second involves the fact that the elections weren't even fair. And so wasn't it in that sense a rational decision?
Oh, gee, thanks.
Yep.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but it boils down to whether what the seculars did was rational or irrational.
I guess, in other words, wasn't it rational to boycott voting?
No. Not if the goal is to build a new democracy. One of the things that's so interesting, and this I meant to make this point when, in the first question, is when you look at Iran, remember, Iran was initially, Ayatollah Khomeini went back to Qom, said no clerics could run for office, couldn't be part of government. They put a group of technocrats in power, and it was only as the opposition began to fall apart and the secular versus the religious element evolved, and writing a constitution, they came up with 62 versions, 4,000 amendments offered, and so forth. And it was as the situation began to deteriorate, and they actually began killing each other, or people were dying, that Khomeini came back from Qom and said, and the seculars were pledged to boycott the referendum on one of the two constitutions, both of which had no role for the clerics, were based totally on French and Belgian law. And he said, well, because the seculars won't participate, and there's such disputes, and there's all this bloodshed, we're going to have an election for an assembly of experts who will then write it. And guess who was elected to the assembly of experts? Because the secular parties vowed, to boycott it. And, this is where you can make all kinds of arguments to justify why not to participate. But the fact is, you can't believe in democracy and not participate, whether it's as a candidate or as a voter.
We're about to close up. Karen's approaching the podium. I just want to say one final thing apropos this young man's question and what we expected. I guess revolutions or social upheavals are always moments of truth where society has to face itself in ways that it has been avoiding. The contradictions that have been building up are the things that give rise to these kinds of social explosions. And those contradictions come face to face with each other. And you come to know a society and a people in a way that you never really had been able to before. And I have to admit some disappointment because it's a country I've spent a lot of time in. I love it. It's not a country like Iraq that could fly apart. Egypt would never do that. It has a sense of it being eternal. It is Egypt. It doesn't have parts of it. They're going to fly off the handle. But to see the sectarianism rise in the spirit of Tahrir Square, that magic has to be preserved somehow in the Egyptian consciousness. And let's hope that whatever happens in the next few years, we still feel that.
So, takeaways, that's always my job. But they've done a really good job of it themselves. I guess there are a couple obvious takeaways. One is to think of transition as the fog of transition. The other is this very fragile society in which there's chaos, how much of it is going to get stable and what role is chaos going to play. But to me, the big takeaway tonight is actually something pretty interesting, which is that Larry started by talking about the American Civil Rights Movement. And there's been a running theme here about sort of the United States as a kind of wise observer. And like we went through our transitional moment, which happened to take 150 years, somebody pointed out. And I think that's fascinating. Egypt is as old a culture as we know, as ancient a culture as we're in touch with. It's so interesting that the idea that the observer that seems to have some kind of wise sense of this would be the United States. And I don't mean that in any kind of value way, I just think it's something to think about. Second thing I want to bring up has to do with Eastern Europe. Now, the biggest transition we've seen is Eastern Europe. It's not, we may have seen other transitions, but it would be interesting to do the thought experiment on what we actually saw. And I don't mean just Russia. I mean Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Poland. And what's actually happened, because many of these issues, the old people trying, the elders being in charge, even though it was a young revolution, the fact that the political transition was not the same thing as the cultural transition. We have seen this before, and different countries have done it different ways. And so, so I envision another panel soon, so you're all going to have to come back. I want to thank Susan Quattrone for putting this together, and the staff of the Center on National Security. I want to thank you for coming, and please join me in thanking our panelists.